musicians. So in this episode we are going to be talking about the Baroque period of music. So the Baroque period of music was one of our periods of music that lasted from 1600 to 1750. It was about 400 years ago, and the overall adjective that I would use to describe this period is fancy. Everything was fancy, whether it was the architecture, or the clothing, or the hairstyles, or the music, or the art. Everything was very fancy. And a lot of this originated from Louis XIV, who we will be talking about a little bit later. So let's jump in to what life was like during this era. It was very different than our life today. I know a lot of you have probably heard of Shakespeare. William Shakespeare was still writing plays in this era. Shakespeare is widely considered as the world's greatest playwright, one of the world's greatest authors. He wrote 38 plays and 154 sonnets, so he was a busy, busy man. Some fun facts to tell you a little bit what life was like in this era. In 1672, which is technically 72 years after the era started in the 1600s, an angry Dutch mob ate, yes, you heard me correctly, they ate their own prime minister, whose name was Johan de Witt. Louis XIV, who I mentioned previously, he was in charge of France. A fun fact about Louis, he was extravagant, he loved glitz and glam. And a fun fact about Louis XIV, he decreed that the table knife must have a rounded tip so that both the streets and the courts would see less violence. And if you look at a table knife today, or a butter knife, it still has a rounded tip. So thank you, Louis XIV, for that. The barber would pull your loose teeth. He would give you a haircut, and then you would sit there and he would pull your loose teeth. So you better be brushing your teeth in the Baroque era because your hairdresser is pulling them. Something else very exciting happened in this era. Chocolate milk was invented. An Irishman named Hans Soline was visiting Jamaica in 1680. He noticed that the locals would mix cocoa and water. He found that nauseating, but he tried mixing with milk and he loved it. So he brought it back to England, and it was actually made and sold by pharmacies as medicine. So that's how chocolate milk started. So thank you, Baroque era, for that. So I know how we discussed that everything in this era was fancy, that the clothing, the architecture, the wigs, the art, and the music was all very fancy. So they would take the music that was previously written and they would add different embellishments to the music to make it fancier. So some of the embellishments that they used were trills, turns, and appoggiaturas. So some of these words might be familiar to you, and some of them may not be familiar to you. A trill is still often used in our music today, in band music, and orchestra music especially. A trill is when you go from one note to another note very, very quickly. So this adds a sense of fanciness and excitement to the music that it wouldn't normally have. Another variation of this is a turn. A turn is almost like a wave in the music. So you start at your original note, go up, go down, and back to your original note. So it's da-da-da-da-da, that's a turn. And this was also incorporated in the music, both instrumentalists and singers during this era, and it created a sense of fanciness in the music. The last one is an appoggiatura. An appoggiatura is often used, but many people don't know that it's an appoggiatura. So it's a quick note before the main note. So almost like a grace note, if you've heard of a grace note. So da-da, that's an appoggiatura. And that little embellishment just creates another sense of fanciness in the music. So now that we have discussed some of the compositional techniques that were used in the Baroque era, we're going to talk a little bit about this new orchestra that was formed for the first time in this era. This time period is when we really saw our current looking orchestra come about in music history. String instruments were grouped into sections in the orchestra for the first time in the Baroque era, and the harpsichord was added. So a harpsichord is kind of like the grandfather to our modern day piano. It looks like a piano, but goose feathers would pluck strings when you would hit the key, which then turned into the piano later on. In this orchestra, the cello and bass played the underlying chords in the pieces while the harpsichord played the melody on top. So it's almost like our rock band. If you think about it like that, you have the bass and you have the melody on top. In this orchestra, there were 3 violins, 3 violas, 3 cellos, 2 basses, a harp, 2 flutes, 2 oboes, and 1 bassoon. There was also a timpani. The clarinet came later in the period, so at the beginning of the Baroque era, there was no clarinet. There was sometimes a trumpet and a horn added to the orchestra as well. So, some other interesting differences between the Baroque orchestra and our orchestra today is everyone stood. So there was no chairs, everyone stood up while they were playing, and the harpsichord was placed in the middle of the orchestra, and they almost acted as the conductor. There was no person up with a baton. The harpsichord was in charge, and the entire orchestra listened to the harpsichord. Another difference was there was no women. Women did not play in an orchestra during this era, which is different than today, clearly. So now that we have talked about the compositional techniques that were used in this era and the orchestras that were used in this era, I want to hit on some famous composers from the era. There were, of course, lots of people who composed during the Baroque era. We're going to focus on 3 today. So these 3 are like the highlights of the whole era. Their music is still performed, played today, and they are very important in music history for creating the music that created the music of today. So the first one that we are going to talk about is Antonio Vivaldi. So Vivaldi was born in 1678 in Venice, Italy, and he died in Vienna, Austria, in 1741. Vivaldi's most famous piece is the Four Seasons, which you were actually listening to earlier in this video. You were listening to Winter from the Four Seasons. He was a violin player as well as a composer, and he wrote 500 other concertos other than the Four Seasons. Because he was a violin player, around 230 of those were violin concertos. He wrote the Four Seasons in 1717, and what this piece is every movement is about a certain season. So it starts with spring, and then summer, and then autumn, and then winter. Let's listen to a bit of that now. Next, we're going to talk about another very major composer during this era. His name was George Frederick Handel. George Frederick Handel was most commonly known for his piece called The Messiah. The Messiah is an English language oratorio that was composed in 1741. It's often played and sung around Christmas time. It is still performed by choirs and orchestras close to Christmas time and other times throughout the year. George Frederick Handel was born in 1685 and he died in 1759. He was a German composer, however he spent most of his career in London. He wrote 30 oratorios and almost 50 operas, so he loved writing for vocal performers as well as orchestras, and he is known mostly for his operas and Handel's Messiah. Let's take a listen to that now. composer that we're going to talk about is Johann Sebastian Bach. A lot of you have probably heard about Bach at some point in your musical career. Bach was a German composer, and he was known for his instrumental compositions as well as his fugues. He was born in 1685 in Germany, and he died in Germany in 1750. So let's talk a little bit about this Bach fugue. He is very well known for these fugues, and he wrote them for organ. So a fugue is a compositional technique that uses two or more voices, and it takes a subject or a musical theme or melody, and that melody is introduced at the beginning of the piece. Then it is used multiple times throughout the piece by different voices. So you'll hear the melody in a higher voice, and then as that melody is being played, you'll hear it come in again in a lower voice. As the two are being played, you'll hear it again in a third voice, and so on and so forth. As the piece continues, that melody develops and changes, and this continues to happen, and the melodies come in and out throughout the whole piece, and the piece develops and changes with the melody. So that's what a fugue is. Bach was very, very well known for these fugues. We're going to listen to a little bit of one of his fugues. This fugue is called Little Fugue in G minor, and is performed on organ. If you don't know what an organ is like a huge piano with pipes. So if you push a key down on the organ, it sends air through these huge pipes, and it creates this enormous sound. They're often seen in churches and things like that. So, as we're listening to this fugue, I want you to really take note of those different voices. They will be pretty clear to find in the piece, so listen for the entrances of those voices. Also see if you can hear some other Baroque compositional techniques that we previously talked about.